Hi, I'm Sean. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to be talking a little bit about games and learning, games and change, games for change, and a couple of big picture ideas about what all this stuff means for you and for us as everyday citizens, but also in terms of creative projects and creative work. But before we do that, we have to play a game. So I am now going to ask you to use these red and blue pieces of paper because we're going to play a little icebreaker game to get everybody going here first thing in the morning. I'm going to go get my red and blue paper. This is a game that's called Outliers, designed by a friend of mine, Colleen Macklin. She is at Parsons in New York City. And it's a fun game to try to get everybody to think a little bit, not just about your own opinions on things, but what the entire crew, the entire group in the room might believe about a particular topic. Let me explain what that means. What we're going to do is everybody stand up. You've got a red card and you've got a blue card, right? What we're going to do is we're going to vote for a red option or a blue option for a series of different options here. And your goal is to stay in the minority. Your goal is not to be in the majority answer. So let's practice with cats or dogs here. So go ahead and on the count of 3, I'll say 1, 2, 3, shoot. Go ahead and put up your vote for cats or for dogs. Okay, 1, 2, 3, shoot. I'm a cat guy. Okay, cool. Now I judge, and it looks like to me we've got the dogs squeaking out a win here. And if this was the first round of the game, what would we do? All of the dogs would sit down, and the cats would have won that round. So your goal is to try to figure out not just what your own personal opinion is, but to figure out what the entire room is likely to do, and try to stay in the minority all the way until the end. And whoever is the last person standing will win a little prize that we'll send you to Lance to go get later. Okay? You all ready? All right, let's do this. All right, so one answer, and if you're in the majority, you sit down. If you're in the minority, you are still in, and whoever is left standing at the end is going to win. Round 1, coffee or tea? 1, 2, 3, vote. So red is, I think tea is winning here, so coffee stays. Tea, sit down. Oh, you're all out thinking yourselves. Already. Yeah. All right, ready for round 2? Those of you who successfully, round 2 is phones. Android or iPhone? 1, 2, 3, shoot. Looking like, I think iPhone, so I think that means Android. You're staying up, and iPhone, sit down. All right? Round 3, the Charlottesville question. Photos or the whiskey jar? 1, 2, 3, shoot. Okay, got blue, red. Ooh, this is a tighter one. I think whiskey jar's the majority. Photos wins. How many are left? I guess 6, right? So let's see how we do this one. Round 4, the game-themed one. Minecraft or Settlers of Catan? 1, 2, 3, shoot. Red, blue, red, red, red. Oh, that means blue wins. You're the winner. Hey, congratulations. So talk to Lance after we're done, and he'll have a little prize for it. So one of the interesting things about this game is that you have to think about what other people in the room are likely to think. If we had gone on further, we would have gone through a superhero round, a presidential round, a dispositional round, and will this ever end round. We broke a little bit of ice playing some games here. My predilection in games is to talk about performative games and to talk about actually face-to-face games, which I'm going to do at the end of this talk. The beginning of the talk is really going to be focused a lot about how we think about gaming and what the sort of the history of gaming is, as well as what I see as being a lot of problems with the current world of games. So if you're unfamiliar with games, I'm trying to aim this at a little bit of a higher level to give you a sense of how we talk about games, as well as what I see as some of the challenges that we've got in the field of game studies right now. So I am an academic. I hope you got a chance to see some of the games that I put out there on the tables. It's a little hard to play them on the tables out there, but if you get a chance afterwards, if you have a couple minutes, I'm happy to talk to you about tabletop games and the kinds of variety of tabletop games there are out there. That is the metagame up there. I left that up there for people to play with. That's actually designed by the same person, Colleen Macklin, along with local number 12. Colleen Macklin just designed that Outliers game that we just played, as well as a couple other fun light games. I use these kinds of games in instruction. I use these kind of games in a variety of classes that I teach at UVA, including a games and play course, a critical game design course, and a game cultures course. But I've been studying games now for about a decade, like Lance said, looking at a variety of games. And I mean games not just in terms of digital video games, but in terms of card games, board games, role-playing games, performative games. And that's really going to be informing the kind of approach that I'm talking about here today. That is, games are not just one kind of thing. They're not just one kind of digital artifact. They are varied and diverse. But that's not to say that digital games are not also very, very big. Digital games are enormous, as many of us know, and as many of you have presumably interacted with either as players or in some cases designers. I'm going to be talking a little bit about gaming culture from that perspective more in the beginning of the talk today, and then sort of get us back into talking about performance and thinking about what games mean in everyday life by the end of the talk. So I'm the author or editor of this book, Learning in Video Game Affinity Spaces. What that means in non-academic jargon is essentially looking at gaming culture. How people talk about games, think about games, design games, sort of meld between play and design and critique around games. My interests have always been in what people do around games and how people think about games rather than the actual play of games. There are psychologists, there are game designers, there are computer scientists who focus much more on the nitty-gritty of design. I'm much more interested in what happens when people step back and they start to think critically about gaming. So this term game, I put this up here in intentionally monolithic-looking font. This is an interesting topic for me when it was presented. You'd think that somebody who's studied games for 10 years would sort of leap at the chance to talk about games, and I did, but when I saw the word game, maybe it's because it was presented in the singular like this, I suddenly felt a little bit of unease. It caused me to actually question a little bit, like, how much am I actually wanting to talk about games? Why am I feeling this weird unease about talking about game, whatever game might be? And that started to dawn on me as I was preparing this talk that the term itself is very, very loaded these days. The term has got a lot of different meanings, and I'll go through a couple of them here with you here in the beginning, but the first half of this talk is about tearing down some of these definitions of games and getting us to think a little bit more critically about what we really want to talk about rather than this one term. So, games. Here's tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe. Everybody knows tic-tac-toe, right? One of the most dominant ways of talking about games is as systems, is talking about them as a set of mechanics that lead into a variety of different systems that interact and that lead to some sort of aesthetic output from that. That is, you end up having some sense of fun, some sense of challenge, because people have made rules, and the rules here are quite simple. You take turns, you put an X down, you put an O down, it blocks off the space where somebody else can't go. And there's a limited number of spaces you can go in future turns. It's a pretty simple game, but the mechanics of those scaffold and build up into the pleasure of playing something like a tic-tac-toe, well, at least until you're 7 and then you don't play it anymore, right? But the principles of that are understandable across a lot of different games. Mechanics leading to a variety of other kinds of dynamics and things you experience in a game. You end up seeing that in everything all the way up to a Minecraft. It's still the same kind of principle that there are core rules in a game that just get much, much more complex and need to be implemented in computers because imagine playing a board game version of Minecraft and your mind would explode. This is extremely complex. It's a kind of space where you explore, you interrogate the space, you do all sorts of fun creative work within it. But all those are still based on a bunch of very, very simple mechanics. So as we think a little bit about games, we start thinking about what do we do with those mechanics? What are some of the things that we can think about with game mechanics, and why would we want to think about them? And one of the dominant things in the last decade has actually been this idea of gamification. How many of you have ever heard this term, gamification? Okay. Have any of you ever experienced or played around with or created a gamified setting in some cases? Yeah, so it's become pretty dominant in the last couple of years. When it started off in about, I guess about a decade ago, it was really in some ways a branch of the games and learning movement. It was a kind of a way that people were extending what they saw as the power of games that had been documented in all sorts of other kinds of places to making people do things that they normally wouldn't want to do. That is using achievements, using badges, using all sorts of other kinds of motivating kinds of technologies to try to get people to continue to do different kinds of things online that they might not be incentivized to do otherwise. Okay. Gamification, in many ways, is a way that it's a project that adapts the language of games. It adapts the mechanics of games. It adapts some of the approaches of games. But it's also not a game. Gamification is about taking elements of games and then building things from those elements of games. And I want to be a little bit critical of that here, because I think in some ways the notion of gamification has had a really big impact in terms of the ways we design all sorts of online tools. There are many app developers here in the room. I'm sure that many of you have run into occasions in which gamification ideas have spilled over into some of your own work. In my world, it's broken into the design of educational environments and the design of educational tools quite a bit. And in many ways, very well-meaning and very interesting kinds of games have developed out of this. But people have looked at games as being a thing that we can use to do another thing with. And I want to be critical of that a little bit, because I think when we start thinking about games as being objects that we can take from, objects that we can apply as essentially tools, then we start needing to think a little bit more critically about why we're doing that, what kinds of baggage that brings to our projects, and what kinds of damage we might be doing to the very idea of play and gaming. That is, are we, to mix metaphors here, go from the hammer to the strip mine, are we strip mining the notion of play outside of play environments and putting them into things that are not necessarily supposed to be play environments? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Additionally, people in education have talked quite a bit about this notion of chocolate-covered broccoli. Has anybody ever run into this idea before? This is one that I don't think gets a lot of traction outside of the education world, but it certainly has a lot of traction in the education world. That is, people are very sensitive to the idea that, hey, if we're going to take fun things and start to slap them onto unfun things, what are we doing if not that? Right? People are very sensitive to that idea, and I think for good reason. Right? Where we would be very, very concerned about a gaming kind of environment that would have. We have some lights. We should be very concerned about serious kinds of work environments that have too much of a gamey layer on it. If people are only licking the chocolate off of the broccoli and not getting down to the broccoli, then we've got some problems, right? But that term game, I think, is being used by the gamifiers, is being used by a lot of the games and learning folks in ways that I think are a little simplistic, are ways that are focused so much on, to go back to the chocolate-covered broccoli notion here, there are viewing games as ingredients and viewing games as being a thing that you can put into another culinary kind of environment, some other kind of learning environment, some kind of working environment. That might not actually be what games are. That might not actually be where the power of games are. That might not be where all the enjoyment of games are. So when I'm coming back to this notion of game, I want to think a little bit about how are people taking that notion and how are they applying it to some of these other settings, and what are they not thinking about? What are they focusing on? They're focusing on the mechanics, they're focusing on the technologies, they're focusing on the thing itself, but they aren't really focusing too much on some other stuff that I'll get to in a second. I have a second qualm about the term game. The term game is one that has, I think, got a little bit of a negative connotation in a lot of modern culture, a lot of contemporary culture. And I want to be very honest about that. Gamergate. Many of you have heard of this. I don't know how many for whom this is still a salient issue, but I'll tell you this. When I was trying to put together the slide, I went through about 6 or 7 different slide designs before I could actually get to one that didn't offend me when I was putting this together. Gamergate was a moment that happened over the last couple of years in which there was consistent harassment, misogynistic harassment by male gamers towards women game developers, players, academics, and was one in which the notion of what a game was became centrally fought over. It was the thing that the players were in many cases defending to the death and to the detriment of online culture, to the detriment of these women who are working within the within these industries, and also to the detriment of games and gaming culture. In many ways, it's interesting to me how this entire situation was sort of cast as being defense of games. If you're familiar with the phrase ethics in game journalism, that was a very regular phrase that Gamergaters would use to defend what they were really talking about. They're not really attacking women. What we are doing is actually defending and interrogating ethics in games journalism. Yeah, right. But the idea here is that they were defending this notion of a game. Right? The game was what was so important to them, at least ostensibly what was most important to them, that it was being used as a shield to protect them from what they were actually doing in these communities. Oop, keynote, don't do that. There we go. And I want to draw a direct line back to here. Not to put a disturbing and sad photo here up on the screen, but the very communities that were being created during the Gamergate movement, the very social media celebrities, the very networks of individuals who were involved in Charlottesville using gaming. This is an image I actually grabbed off of a Gamergater's website, and this is of a NBC News piece about last August that references down here that they used a messaging service called Discord, which is a very common gamer messaging service. They were using the same infrastructures, the same networks that the Gamergaters were using to build and develop the coalition that ended up bringing this to our town last year. So I think this is really serious in many ways, that thinking about games, I hate to be such a downer, but I mean, to think about games implies also thinking about gaming culture and thinking about who's playing games and what they're using it for. Right? And why is this really tied to games? Isn't this just a thing about internet culture? A recent book just came out last month by Chris Paul called The Toxic Meritocracy of Video Games, Why Gaming Culture is the Worst, which is probably my favorite title for a book that I've read in the past year. And his point is that this is actually inherent to games themselves. That is, the meritocracy of these gaming communities. That is, you got to be better than the next people. And that means not just being better than the next people in terms of playing a game, but being better than the others in terms of arguing online, in terms of challenging people online, in terms of trolling, in terms of doxing, in terms of harassment, going all the way up the chain, that evolves from a focus on competition, which is a central thing to so many games. Chris Paul makes the argument that games themselves lead to this toxic meritocracy that we see happening all over and spilling all over the internet. So like I said, I'm being a little bit of a downer here to start, but there's a happy side to this in a minute. I also want to make it really clear that I'm not equating these two things. I'm not saying that gamification is the same thing as the angry gamer. Instead, I'm saying that they both have a common problem. And that common problem is that they are both thinking about games in a too limited of a fashion. They're thinking about games as things. They're thinking about games as objects, and they're thinking about games as technologies in many cases. On the left, we're seeing games being thought of as technologies that we can use to create new things that are not games out of them, while on the right, we're seeing technologies that can be used in order to justify waging different kinds of social media misogynistic wars, essentially. So, coming back to that term game, I want to flip it. I don't want to talk about the thing anymore. I want to talk about what we do with the thing. Because what we do with the thing can be liberating, can be exciting, can be interesting, can be critical, and can hopefully give you guys a sense of hope over the kinds of ways that we can think about gaming, not just in terms of entertainment games, but things that you can do and things that we can all do together to introduce more play and to introduce more critical forms of play into everyday life. So, this is a slide from yesterday, an image I took yesterday when I was teaching a class. So I'm teaching a class called Critical Game Design. It is a course with primarily seniors at UVA right now. There are a mix of students. Some of them are media studies. Some of them come from outside of that department. And the whole point of the course is to make games about something, make games that are critical about a thing. And that thing could be very, very different depending on the student and depending on the student project that they're working on. In some cases, the students are making games about surveillance and the Facebook privacy scandal. In some cases, students are making games about racial profiling. And students are trying to understand, like, how do I take this serious big issue and how do I make it so that it's playable or understandable in a fashion through a form of play. And almost all of them, in fact, all of them this semester, are making non-digital games and performative games and role-playing type games in many cases. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Here we've got students playing a game called Winterhorn. This is a game that was not designed by my students. This is designed by a designer in Chapel Hill named Jason Morningstar. And it is a game in which all of the players gather together and go through a series of cards, and they have roles that they're playing, and they try to identify like the story that emerges out of these cards, all around the central point of disrupting a political activist group. So the students are playing as essentially government agents in a fictional country who are attempting to infiltrate, disrupt, and damage a political activist movement in a group called Winterhorn. And it was a really interesting game for us to play this week. And I'll talk here a little bit about why, because one of the things that really jumped at me that I wanted to share with you were the ways that students had a lot of laughter, a lot of uncomfortable happiness in working together, a lot of interesting collaboration that they did here, all working on the evil side, let's say, just to be really blunt about this. They were playing as the group that was attempting to disrupt a genuine political movement. And this game was designed as a way to teach people who were involved in those actual movements about the kinds of strategies that were used. And yet my students were having a ball playing it. It was very interesting. And we sat back and reflected on this yesterday. I was saying, like, wait a second, I'm starting to have some really strange feels about this. I was having a lot of fun doing this, but weren't what we were doing really bad? Why am I feeling happy about this? There's this interesting disconnect that you can have when you're adopting a role in a game-like environment like this, acting out a thing that you normally wouldn't want to do, but it's also a game, right? People play games for enjoyment. They play games to talk to one another. They play games to work through problems together, right? So there's a weird disconnect that my students were having there. And that got me thinking a little bit more about another game that I think is even more well-formed for this kind of purpose. A game that some of you might have heard of called Train. Has anyone heard of this game? Oh, okay, great. So this is a game that, that is about, I guess, 7 or 8 years old now, but it's always the one game that the students in my courses want to talk the most about. This is a game developed by a woman named Brenda Romero, and it is a game that, can anybody guess just from looking at this what the game might be about? Yes? Yes, getting as many people as you can into a train. Anybody read any other meanings into this imagery on the screen? Yeah, this is a Holocaust game. So each yellow, and yellow is significant, yellow pawn represents 10,000 people. In the game, the rules instruct you to move those people onto the trains and then give you certain rules to move those trains down the track, at which point you flip over a card and it says Auschwitz or it says Dachau. Okay? Heavy game. And this is not what many of you probably expected I was talking about in terms of games today. And on top of that, Brenda had purchased a genuine SS typewriter from that era, right? Which she was very conflicted about. She's talked about this. She felt disgusted that she spent the money to buy an actual piece of Nazi memorabilia. But she wanted that to be a salient physical part of this game. And that's where the instructions are given in the game. And on top of that, it's on a pane of broken glass, which has also got other signifiers to it as well. So what happens when people actually play this game? My students find this game ultimately very fascinating, but we don't have access to it, so we can't play it. So they have to speculate a little bit. But when we talk, when we hear a little bit about what people actually did when they played the game, they find it very, very interesting and also really troubling, because a non-significant proportion of players figure out what the game's about, and they want to keep playing the game. They're like, I want to understand what it's like to be a Nazi. I want to understand what it's like to put people on trains and to follow through with these rules. Other non-significant section of players say, I'm not going to do this. And the ways they say, I'm not going to do this are really interesting. Some of them will subvert other players. Some of them will try to screw up their own play. Some of them will just sit down and say, no, this is a game about the Holocaust. We're not doing this. She actually presented this to a rabbi once, who walked in the door, saw it, said no, and then walked right out. And Brenda said, and the rabbi said, no, I'm not going to play this game. And the rabbi said, no, I'm not going to play this game. And Brenda said, actually, you just did. So this is what's interesting to me about this. When we have these kinds of games in which not playing the game is deemed a valid form of play, that's really different from the kinds of games that we normally think about. That's really different from the kinds of ways we've normally thought about what games can even be used for. We're not using games to motivate people to do something else. We're not using games here purely as some form of mindless entertainment. We're using a thing that uses game mechanics, game systems, game rules, in order to try to convey a different kind of message, in order to try to convey a message that's not coming top down from the designer necessarily, but one that is kind of an interaction between the designer and the people playing the games. So that's really, really interesting to me. Like when you have people validated as being able to subvert the game, as being a key part of one of the successful ways to play the game, that's really different from playing a standard video game. If you are able to just not play the game and really realize this is a difficult and uncomfortable thing for you to play, that's also a valid way to play the game. Quitting a game is actually viewed as being a valid and meaningful way of playing this particular game. That gets me thinking, not to be too flippant about it, but to lighten the mood a little bit here, of other kinds of ways that we've seen futility as being an end state of a game. If anybody remembers War Games, they just showed it at the Alamo a couple of weeks ago, and I happened to catch it, so it was on my mind. But the idea of the game of thermonuclear war as being an unwinnable and thus silly game is an interesting one as well. You could see this kind of game playing out in not just these particularly historical and politicized moments like Winterhorn or in something like Train, but you can also see this play out in all sorts of other different kinds of settings as well. So when we start thinking about this, beyond failure, quitting becomes a part of playing these games, and the action of the player starts to become a lot more relevant. That playing a game is not the same as just consuming a game. And that's the perspective that I want to focus on here for the rest of the talk. And this is really, in some ways, piggybacking off of the work of Bernie DeCoven. And Bernie, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of weeks ago, was a kind, generous, amazing scholar of games and play. Part of the New Games movement in the 1970s. He was really behind a lot of efforts to create more cooperative forms of play, less competitive forms of play, plays that brings people together and gets people to talk and gets people to, in some cases, act extremely silly with one another. He was a joyous and wonderful guy, and I'm going to let him speak for himself here on the tension between making a game about something, but also then letting the player do what they want to do with the game. That's what's at the core of Winterhorn. That's actually what's at the core of a game like Train. These very serious kinds of games in which you also have the space to do other stuff. So I'm going to let him talk here very briefly. This is from a video that he recorded last fall when he was awarded a Lifetime of Play Award by the Games for Change group, and he was asked to speak a little bit on the ways he's thought that games made for something might interact with this idea of play that he's been entertaining.
Fun. Yep, fun. That's the first and biggest connection that I can think of. All of us, despite the seriousness of our purposes, believe in fun. In our heart of hearts, we believe in fun. Even if the games we make are full of hard lessons, we know that the games themselves are somehow fun. Oh, we know they're games, but we also know that in their being fun, they have yet another message. A message that transcends whatever importance, whatever other purposes we ascribe to the games themselves. Fun. Fun is the message, and is enough of a message. A moment of fun is gift enough, profound enough, significant enough. Considering how serious people have to be most of the time, giving them the chance to lighten their hearts, their moods, their moment of being together, to enjoy themselves and each other, maybe for no reason at all other than being given the opportunity. Fun itself is gift enough.
So this notion of fun, we have to question what that means, right? So, but for him, I think it's a pretty useful umbrella term. That what he's talking about here is joy, it's happiness, it's novelty, it's challenge, it's play, just simple free play that happens around a game. That games are not necessarily useful only as delivery devices, as tools, as things to send our messages out to other people in the world, but they are places for other people to make meaning from the things that we give them, right? I'm talking from the perspective of a designer and perspective of someone who is giving people games here, but we all know this as players as well, right? That we've experienced all sorts of things and made the best fun out of something that was not particularly fun to begin with. We're active. We do things with games and do things with play environments all the time. So his argument here is that whatever purposes we ascribe to the games themselves, fun is the message and is enough of a message. And I think that's a really interesting point for us to think about here too. In some ways, it's like letting go of the game design. It's letting go of the idea that we need to be the ones to deliver a game message or some kind of message through a game. That what we can do is give people structures, we can give people systems, and then see what they do with those systems. And I think that's a point that is generalizable beyond just games. And I think that's a point that I want us to think a little bit about, because this chocolate-covered broccoli idea comes back, right? That the chocolate-covered broccoli idea is predicated on the idea that we're trying to give people broccoli. That's a part of the entire system here, that we need to give people broccoli, and thus we're going to try to come up with the most pleasant way to slather something on top of that to give that to them, without thinking about, well, what else are they eating? What else? Why are we giving them broccoli? What is the purpose of giving them broccoli? Right? What do they do when they're playing with their food? Right? Getting them to think a little bit more about the different ways that that we engage with different messages that we get from media, that we engage with different messages that we get from games, is part of the point here. So I've got 3 big takeaways that I'd like to leave you with, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion, which actually aren't only about games, in my opinion. They come out of thinking about games in this particular way and play in this particular way, but I think they could be generalizable to all sorts of other ways we design systems, whether those systems are technical systems or whether those systems are social systems. When we create things that other people have to interact with, then we need to think a little bit about what they're doing when they're interacting with them. So my 3 takeaways that come from the games literature here are, 1, games have always been more than just their systems. Games have always been irreducible, not reducible to just their core systems. That is, people are always a part of the mix. People are always playing games, and people are always making meaning of games, right? If you were to say that baseball is simply the rules of baseball, you'd get laughed at by a Yankees or a Red Sox fan, probably, because they've been playing this week. You would get laughed at by any fan of any sport. Thinking about the ways that the social community arises around a game and makes meaning for it, and the ways that we think through what those meanings are, and we argue about those meanings, and those meanings become parts of our lives, are also part of the games themselves. Number 2, to just echo what Bernie was saying here, fun is often more important than your message. And I want to put fun in scare quotes here, because I think we can get really misleaded into thinking fun just means like having a great time. My students were having fun when they were playing Winterhorn. They were engaging with each other. They were laughing. They were really involved in playing the game, but they got even more serious and more, I would argue, fun when they started critiquing their own enjoyment, when they started thinking about, oh my gosh, what am I doing here? I'm having fun role-playing this character that I find absolutely repellent. That kind of deeper sense of fun is something that we can encounter in all sorts of different kinds of media. And 3, player choice and player agency should always matter. That is, this is known to anyone who has made a thing and sent it off into the world. People will do with it as they do with it, right? That is, when you are releasing something into the wild, you don't control what the user is going to be doing with it. You'd like to, in some cases. You'd like to guide them in some cases. You'd like to provide them ways to do it better, or in the ways that you've wanted them to, but there's always going to be other uses that people are going to be developing. That's a key part of games. That's a key part of understanding how people play games, is that games are not simply delivery devices, but games are things that are providing structures and systems for people to engage with, and those structures and systems are things that ultimately we are going to pick up and do what we will with. This is actually a political point, in my opinion. This is a political point and an ethical point. This is something that values players, not just as users, not just as consumers, but as agents, as people who are actually able to to think through and critique and make their own meaning out of the things that you provide them. So ultimately, what I'm arguing here is that we are all players, that we are all doing this every day. We're always engaging with systems, whether they happen to be game-like systems or not. We may not be gamers. We may find that term to be difficult, but we play, and we play constantly in these kinds of ways, right? So reclaiming play isn't really just about taking a term and sort of putting lipstick on the pig of gaming culture right now. No, it's also about valuing resistance. It's about valuing critique. It's about valuing responsible citizenship, in my opinion. It's about seeing the ways that systems exist and then engaging with them and thinking about them in deeper and more meaningful ways. This is about living a critical life, in my opinion. That games are just a microcosm that give us a sense of the ways that we do this every day and in some of the ways that we might be doing this in the future. So, thank you.
I'll just start with one. I'm personally really curious. I just got to know, like, what are your favorite games?
Oh, what are my favorite games? Those are always the questions. I have one digital game and I have one non-digital game. The digital game this sounds too timely, but it is my favorite game. It's the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Came out last year, and I've now put like 230 hours into this game, primarily because I'm playing with my 4-year-old. And he just wants to climb stuff all of the time. If you're unfamiliar with this game, it's the latest Zelda game, but it's a game in which there's not a lot of narrative you have to follow. You can just run around and explore environments all the time. Non-digital game is a game called Android Netrunner. I'd be surprised if anybody's heard of this game. Has anybody ever heard of this game or played it? Excellent. We need more players in Charlottesville, so come talk to me. It's a card game. It's a competitive cyberpunk-themed card game. It's got a lot of complexity, and it's really a crunchy game that I really enjoy playing.
And flip side to that, I'm curious what games you think are bad, or maybe bad for the culture, or just like giving games a bad name, or just generally evil.
All right. How honest do I want to be about this?
Honest, let's be honest. Yeah.
All right. So I have a problem with PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds and Fortnite. People play those games? Those are extremely popular games. My students are playing them like crazy. I've got 3 students writing papers about them this semester. These are essentially battle royale games in which you're thrown into an environment and then you have to kill everybody and be the last person standing. So it's a little more violent version of Outliers, let's call it that. And I have a problem with that simply because of the ways that it's, frankly, kind of boring game design. I think in some ways people have argued that it's a fad and will get folded into other kinds of digital game environments as just an option, just a mode down the road. But it feels to me kind of like the most distilled version of violence in video games that I find personally uncomfortable. And maybe this is just like after I became a parent, I started thinking about this a little bit more seriously. But I have a hard time in our current culture of seeing any kind of glorified violence game in that fashion, especially one that's so pared down to its basics.
Is it important to define what a game is and is not? And then, if so, you were mentioning that it could be problematic when games are in territories where they might should be.
I'm not sure.
I'm interested in that, but I'm not sure you can really answer that. But I guess, is it important to define what a game is and what a game is not?
So, in my opinion, I think it's actually kind of folly to do that. Although I think it's, and this is actually after I've been teaching for countless years now, that very topic over and over and over again. One of the challenges, it's interesting to have the conversation around it, while I think the definition is always going to elude us. What counts as a game and what doesn't count as a game has been a constant refrain in academic studies and in popular press around games since the beginning, since at least the beginning of digital games. So is Minecraft a game? Some would actually argue no, because Minecraft is a game environment in which you are not competing with one another. You might be competing by yourself. You might actually not have any competitive goals. It might have too many options. Some have actually argued that they see those games as not being potentially game-like. Similarly, something like Winterhorn or Train might not count as a game for some folks because there's not a definitive end state, especially something like Train. If the end state is that the game ends, that's a little tautological. That's not the kind of end state that makes some people happy with this. But this goes back much longer than digital games as well. There's a famous story that's gone around that I frankly don't know the details of, but I can sort of do a thumbnail sketch, that Ludwig Wittgenstein, back in one of his early philosophical treatises, spent some time talking about how the term game, he used game as his definition, his example of a term that is ultimately undefinable in terms of its boundaries. This was 100 years ago, right? And people have often cited that, but still go back to trying to define what counts as a game and what doesn't count a game. So I think in terms of your goals, it could be important. If you want to design a game, you should understand some of the things that people talk about when they're designing games. If you want to analyze a game, you should try to get a sense of what the boundaries are of that game. But what I'm trying to do, at least with this talk, is sort of explode our notion of that a little bit and say that the game is certainly not the boundary of just the systems and the mechanics that we have traditionally thought that they are.
Excuse me. I've been married for about a year, and my in-laws, they find me hilarious when I play a game because I will root for everyone playing the game, not just myself. Those different approaches to games, do they connect with personalities?
Oh, that's interesting. So are you talking about board games or video games in particular?
Board games. So, like, I want everybody to win at Monopoly, which
Yeah.
is impossible. But
Yeah.
I'll be like, you took all my money. Good
Right.
for you. Like,
So I don't know, like in terms of personality specifically, like you could probably find a psychologist who's looked at that in some way or the other. I can tell you from personal experience and what I've seen with my students that there are certainly students who get very invested in whether or not a game is competitive or not, or very invested in whether or not they view themselves as competitive or not. I mentioned that I play this competitive card game. I'm very active in the community for that, and I've actually started writing some stuff academically about it. I'm kind of loosely planning a book on it. And one of the things that's come up to me that's been really interesting is how they really use the term competitive and casual as like real labels for people within these communities. The casual is the one who's happy when everybody is going to be happy, or is the one who doesn't really care if they win or they lose. And it's used as a derogatory term from people within this community. While competitive is similarly used sometimes as a derogatory term from people within the casual community. So I feel like there are real like self-identification things that people do there. That I don't know if they really map on to personality traits. You'd have to ask a personality-focused psychologist for that, I suppose. But certainly people use those, and they really latch onto them for various reasons. Like, I'm more competitive than you might mean for some people I'm more serious or understand more about the game than you because I'm taking seriously what the game is about. While somebody saying, like, I'm a casual might actually reflect, I actually value the people at the table more than I value what the game is about. That's just a simple dichotomy. There's certainly other ways to think about it too.
Awesome. Let's give Sean one more round of applause.
Thank you.